Something is happening in your emotional field right now, and most people would dismiss it as coincidence, but it isn't. There are moments when you meet someone and your nervous system reacts before your mind can explain it, as if an unseen memory has just been unlocked. Not a memory of this life, but a feeling of recognition so deep it disrupts logic itself. And here's the part almost no one tells you. That instant connection you felt wasn't random, it was your psyche responding to something it has been preparing for far longer than you realize. Some call it destiny, some call it twin flame recognition. But psychologically, it is a mirror being held up to parts of you that have been asleep for years. So the question is not, who is this person? The real question is, why does your entire inner world change the moment they appear in your life? Something happened long before you clicked on this video. Not yesterday, not the day you met them, long before your conscious mind ever noticed their face. Because soul recognition doesn't begin with a conversation. It begins with a disturbance, a subtle shift inside your emotional world that makes absolutely no sense. Perhaps you've experienced it already. You looked into someone's eyes for only a few seconds, yet it felt as though time itself had slowed down. The room was still full of people. The sounds around you never disappeared. Nothing supernatural happened. And yet, internally, everything changed. You couldn't explain why. You couldn't justify it. But from that moment forward, life seemed divided into two chapters, before meeting them, and after. Most people would dismiss this as chemistry. Others would call it coincidence. Some would say you were simply projecting your desires onto another human being. But what if none of those explanations fully captured what you experienced? What if the reason this encounter felt so overwhelming wasn't because your heart became irrational, but because your deepest psychological patterns recognized something before your conscious mind had enough information to understand it? This is where the conversation about soul recognition truly begins. Not with fantasy, not with blind belief, but with a question psychology has quietly explored for decades. Why do certain strangers feel strangely familiar? Why does one person out of billions seem to awaken emotions that nobody else ever could? And why does your body sometimes react before your thoughts can catch up? Think about it. Your brain processes millions of pieces of information every second, but only a tiny fraction ever reaches conscious awareness. The rest is filtered through unconscious memory. Patterns, emotional associations, facial recognition, voice tone, body language. Tiny details your conscious mind never even notices. Your subconscious is constantly asking one question. Have I experienced something like this before? Sometimes the answer comes instantly. Not because you've literally met the person, but because something about them resonates with an emotional blueprint already living inside you. This is one of the reasons soul recognition feels so powerful. Your conscious mind says, I've never met this person. Yet another part of you quietly whispers, yes, somehow you already know them. Have you ever wondered why your first instinct about someone is often more accurate than the opinion you develop weeks later? Science tells us that human beings form first impressions in fractions of a second. Before logic begins, before conversation, before evidence, your nervous system has already started making predictions. It notices posture, micro-expressions, breathing rhythm, eye movement, energy. Not mystical energy necessarily, but emotional signals accumulated through thousands of experiences over an entire lifetime. Your body is always listening, even when your mind isn't. Now imagine something even deeper. Imagine that throughout your life, every relationship, every heartbreak, every disappointment, every moment of love, has slowly built an invisible emotional map inside you. You cannot see it, but it guides nearly every important connection you make. Then one day, someone appears whose presence activates parts of that map all at once. Suddenly memories surface. Dreams become vivid. Old emotions you thought were healed begin returning. You cannot stop thinking about them, even when you try. Especially when you try. That is what makes soul recognition so psychologically fascinating. Because whether you interpret it spiritually or psychologically, the experience itself is undeniably real. The emotions are real. The physical sensations are real. The inner transformation is real. The explanation may differ depending on your worldview, but the impact cannot easily be denied. Many people spend years criticizing themselves for this experience. They say, "Why can't I move on? Why am I still thinking about someone I barely know? What is wrong with me?" Perhaps nothing is wrong with you. Perhaps your mind is attempting to understand an experience that doesn't fit into its existing categories. Human beings naturally search for stories. When something emotionally significant happens, the brain immediately begins creating meaning. It asks, "What does this mean? Why now? Why this person?" Without a satisfying answer, the mind keeps returning to the memory. Again, and again, and again. Not because it enjoys suffering, but because unresolved experiences demand attention. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the mind's need for cognitive closure. The brain dislikes unfinished stories. It wants explanations, resolution, understanding. Now consider what happens when someone enters your life, awakens your deepest emotions, changes your identity, and then disappears. The story remains unfinished. Your mind keeps replaying every detail, every conversation, every silence, every glance, searching desperately for meaning. But here's something most people overlook. Sometimes the person isn't the only thing your mind is searching for. Sometimes, your mind is actually searching for the version of yourself that existed only when they were present. Because certain people don't merely enter your life. They awaken hidden parts of your identity. Parts that had been asleep, forgotten, suppressed beneath years of survival. Perhaps they reminded you how deeply you could love. Perhaps they exposed fears you didn't know you carried. Perhaps they challenged beliefs that had silently controlled your entire life. That kind of encounter changes a person, whether the relationship lasts forever or only a few months. Carl Jung once suggested that what fascinates us most in others often reflects something hidden within ourselves. We project unconscious aspects of our own psyche onto people who seem unusually significant. This doesn't mean the connection is fake. It means the connection becomes a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable, because they reveal both beauty and wounds. This is why soul recognition often feels simultaneously magical and painful. You don't simply see another person. You begin seeing yourself more clearly than ever before. Your strengths, your fears, your unmet needs, your longing to be fully understood. Many viewers watching this today already know exactly what that feels like. You've tried to explain it to friends. They told you to just move on. You shared your feelings with family. They said you were imagining things. People around you couldn't understand why one person could affect you so deeply. Eventually, you stopped talking about it, not because the experience disappeared, but because explaining it became exhausting. And perhaps that's exactly why you found this message today. Not because someone else can define your journey, but because maybe, for the first time, you realize you are not the only person who has ever experienced this profound sense of recognition. Whether you call it destiny, deep attachment, psychological imprinting, or a twin flame connection, one truth remains. Some encounters permanently alter the architecture of your inner world. They change the questions you ask, the dreams you pursue, the wounds you choose to heal. And perhaps that was always their true purpose. Because what if recognizing another soul was never only about finding them? What if it was always the beginning of finally recognizing yourself? In the next chapter, we'll explore why the people who experience these profound connections often share one painful pattern that existed long before the meeting itself. A hidden emotional history of rejection, betrayal, and feeling like they never truly belonged. Understanding that pattern may reveal why this connection felt so different from every relationship that came before it. Before you ever met the person who changed your life. Before your heart raced for reasons you couldn't explain. Before you began questioning whether soul recognition was real. There was another story unfolding. A quieter story. One that began years earlier. Perhaps even in childhood. Because people who experience profound psychological connections often have something in common. Not because they are broken, and not because they are destined to suffer, but because they have spent much of their lives searching for a place where they could finally feel understood. Maybe that sentence landed somewhere deep inside you. Not because someone told you it was true, but because you've lived it. Have you ever walked into a room full of people and still felt completely alone? Have you ever smiled during conversations while secretly feeling disconnected from everyone around you? Have you ever looked at your own family and wondered why you felt like a stranger among people who were supposed to know you best? If so, you are far from alone. Psychologists have long recognized that human beings develop what are called internal working models, deep emotional expectations about ourselves, other people, and relationships. These models are not created overnight. They are formed through thousands of small experiences. A parent who listened. A parent who didn't. Friends who stayed. Friends who disappeared. Teachers who encouraged you. People who laughed at your dreams. None of these moments seem particularly important on their own. But together, they quietly shape the way your nervous system interprets love, safety, rejection, and belonging. Imagine a child who repeatedly feels misunderstood. Not abused. Not neglected in obvious ways. Simply, unseen. Whenever they express sadness, they're told they're too sensitive. Whenever they become excited, they're told to calm down. Whenever they ask difficult questions, they're ignored. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. The child doesn't stop feeling deeply. Instead, they stop believing those feelings deserve to be understood. Years later, that child becomes an adult who appears independent, strong, capable, successful perhaps. But beneath that strength lives a silent question that rarely gets spoken aloud. Will anyone ever truly see me? This question doesn't disappear with age. It simply changes its disguise. It becomes perfectionism, people-pleasing, emotional independence, hypervigilance, or endless searching for the one relationship that finally feels different. Not because someone wants to be rescued, but because every human being longs for emotional recognition. To be known, to be accepted, to feel that someone else understands what words cannot fully explain. That longing is universal. Yet for some people, it becomes especially powerful because it has remained unmet for so long. This is where many intense connections begin. Not with romance, but with recognition. You meet someone who seems to understand you without requiring endless explanations. Conversations flow naturally. Silences feel comfortable. Eye contact lasts just a little longer. You don't feel the need to perform. You don't constantly monitor every word you say. For perhaps the first time in years, you feel emotionally safe. And emotional safety is one of the most powerful experiences the human nervous system can have. Safety doesn't always feel exciting. Sometimes it feels strangely familiar, like returning home after traveling for decades. Have you ever noticed how quickly your body relaxes around certain people? Your breathing slows. Your shoulders soften. You laugh more easily. Your mind stops rehearsing every possible mistake. That isn't weakness. It's regulation. Your nervous system has concluded, at least temporarily, I don't need to protect myself quite so much. Unfortunately, not everyone grows up experiencing this consistently. Some people spend years in environments where emotional unpredictability becomes normal. Love feels conditional. Approval must be earned. Conflict appears without warning. Affection disappears without explanation. Eventually, the nervous system adapts. It becomes extraordinarily skilled at detecting subtle emotional changes. It learns to scan every room, every conversation, Every facial expression, every delayed text message, every shift in someone's tone of voice. This adaptation once served a purpose. It helped you navigate uncertainty. But later in life, it can become exhausting. You become the person who notices everything. The smallest changes, the hidden tension, the emotions other people insist aren't there. Sometimes people even tell you, you're overthinking, you're imagining things, you're too sensitive. But what if sensitivity isn't the problem? What if your nervous system simply learned to observe details others never needed to notice? Highly sensitive people often develop remarkable emotional awareness. They read between the lines. They notice contradictions. They intuit emotional undercurrents before anyone speaks them aloud. Of course, intuition isn't magic. It is often the result of years spent paying close attention to subtle emotional cues. Your brain becomes incredibly efficient at recognizing patterns. That same pattern recognition can also explain why one unexpected encounter feels so overwhelming. Because when someone finally offers consistency, kindness, presence, or genuine curiosity, your nervous system responds immediately. Not because you've become irrational, but because you've encountered something it has quietly needed for years. Now imagine what happens if that same person also reflects your deepest emotional wounds. They understand you, yet they also trigger your fears. They make you feel safe, yet terrified of losing them. They inspire hope, while awakening old abandonment wounds you thought were already healed. This combination creates enormous psychological intensity. And many people interpret that intensity as proof of destiny. Sometimes it is interpreted through the language of twin flames. Sometimes through attachment theory. Sometimes through spirituality. Sometimes through neuroscience. Different frameworks. Similar human experience. One does not automatically invalidate the other. Because regardless of the explanation you prefer, the emotional transformation itself deserves attention. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is believing that people who experience these profound connections are weak. In reality, many of them are remarkably resilient. They survived emotionally confusing childhoods. They learned to comfort themselves. They became caregivers, problem solvers, the dependable friend, the responsible sibling, the person everyone else leaned on. Yet inside, they quietly wished someone would ask, "How are you really doing?" Not as politeness, but because they genuinely wanted to know. Perhaps you've spent years becoming everything everyone else needed. Meanwhile, very few people ever asked what you needed. This creates another hidden pattern. You become extraordinarily good at understanding others, yet surprisingly unfamiliar with yourself. You know everyone's emotions, everyone's problems, everyone's dreams, but your own feelings remain buried beneath responsibility. Then one unexpected connection changes everything. Suddenly, someone asks questions nobody has asked before. They notice your silence. They remember small details. They see beyond the version of yourself you carefully present to the world. And something begins to soften. The walls you spent decades building start to crack. Not because you're becoming weaker, because you're finally becoming visible. Visibility can feel terrifying. After spending years hiding vulnerable parts of yourself, being truly seen can feel almost unbearable. It raises uncomfortable questions. What if they eventually leave too? What if they discover who I really am? What if I lose the only person who understands me? Notice something important. These fears rarely begin with the relationship itself. They usually existed long before the relationship arrived. The connection simply illuminated them. This is why psychologically significant relationships often feel like mirrors. They don't create every wound. They reveal wounds that were already waiting beneath the surface. And although that revelation can be painful, it also creates an extraordinary opportunity. Because you cannot heal what remains invisible. Many people spend years treating symptoms, trying to stop thinking about someone, trying to silence overwhelming emotions, trying to distract themselves. But healing often begins elsewhere. Not with forgetting another person, with remembering yourself. Remembering the child who wanted to be understood. Remembering the teenager who felt different. Remembering the adult who became strong because vulnerability seemed unsafe. When those forgotten parts begin receiving compassion instead of criticism, something remarkable happens. The desperate search for external validation slowly begins to soften. You stop asking, "Who will finally complete me?" and begin asking, "What parts of myself have been waiting for my own acceptance?" This shift changes everything, because the deepest recognition may never have been another soul recognizing yours. It may begin with you recognizing the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime overlooking. And perhaps that is why so many life-changing connections arrive exactly when they do. Not to rescue you from loneliness, not to erase every wound, but to illuminate the places within you that are finally ready to heal. In the next chapter, we'll explore why these emotionally transformative connections often arrive immediately after periods of collapse, loss, betrayal, or profound life disruption, and why what feels like everything falling apart may actually become the psychological foundation for an entirely new version of yourself. There is a question that quietly haunts almost everyone who experiences a connection that changes their life. Why now? Why did this person appear only after everything else seemed to collapse? Why didn't they come when life was easier? Why did they arrive after the heartbreak? After the betrayal? After the loneliness? After the season when you felt as though nothing in your life still made sense? If you've asked yourself these questions, you're touching something profoundly human. Because our minds naturally search for order in moments of chaos. When life falls apart, we instinctively assume something has gone terribly wrong. But psychology tells us something surprisingly different. Sometimes the periods that feel like destruction are actually periods of reconstruction. Not because suffering is inherently meaningful. Not because pain is a requirement for growth. But because major psychological transformation often begins when the old version of ourselves can no longer support the life we're trying to live. Think about a building that has developed invisible cracks over many years. From the outside, it still appears stable. People walk past it every day without noticing anything unusual. The walls are still standing. The lights still work. The structure looks complete. But beneath the surface, the foundation has weakened. Eventually, one small earthquake reveals what had been developing quietly for years. Was the earthquake the real problem? Or did it simply expose a weakness that already existed? Our emotional lives often work the same way. Many people spend years constructing identities based on survival rather than authenticity. They become the reliable one, the caretaker, the peacemaker, the overachiever, the person who never asks for help, the one who always says, "I'm fine," even when they're falling apart inside. From the outside, everything appears successful. Inside, something feels increasingly disconnected. You may recognize this feeling. Perhaps you built a career that impressed everyone around you. Yet every achievement left you strangely empty. Perhaps you remained in relationships long after they stopped nourishing your spirit. Perhaps you kept saying yes when your heart desperately wanted to say no. Perhaps you convinced yourself that this was simply what adulthood looked like. Responsibility, sacrifice, endurance. Until one day, something broke. Maybe it was a relationship ending unexpectedly. Maybe it was losing a job. Maybe it was the death of someone you loved. Maybe it was betrayal from someone you trusted completely. Or perhaps nothing dramatic happened at all. Perhaps you simply woke up one morning and realized, "I can't keep living like this." Psychologists sometimes refer to these experiences as identity disruptions. Moments when the story you've been telling yourself about who you are no longer fits the reality you're living. These moments can feel terrifying, because the human brain craves predictability. We prefer familiar pain over unfamiliar uncertainty. Even unhealthy routines feel safer than stepping into the unknown. That's why people often remain in situations that quietly diminish them. Not because they're weak, because uncertainty activates deep survival mechanisms. Your brain asks, what if leaving makes everything worse? What if starting over is impossible? What if this is the best life I'll ever have? These questions are incredibly common. And yet, history shows that some of humanity's greatest transformations begin precisely at the moment certainty disappears. Consider the caterpillar. There is a stage in its transformation that many people overlook. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar doesn't simply grow wings. Its body actually dissolves. Many of its original structures break down into what scientists describe as a nutrient-rich cellular mass. For a period of time, the old form no longer exists. The new form hasn't fully appeared either. It is neither what it was, nor what it will become. Imagine experiencing that psychologically. Imagine reaching a point where the identity you've relied upon for decades begins dissolving. The habits that once protected you stop working. The relationships that once felt secure begin ending. The dreams that once motivated you lose their meaning. Everything familiar starts slipping away. From the inside, this feels like failure. But perhaps something else is happening. Perhaps your psyche has simply outgrown an identity that was built for survival rather than fulfillment. Carl Jung described this process as individuation, the gradual movement toward becoming the most authentic version of yourself. Interestingly, individuation rarely begins when life is comfortable. It usually begins during crisis, because crisis interrupts automatic living. It forces awareness. Before the collapse, you may have been moving through life on emotional autopilot, repeating the same relationship patterns, choosing familiar dynamics, ignoring your intuition, silencing your needs. Then suddenly, life refuses to let you continue sleeping. Everything that no longer aligns with your deeper self begins demanding attention. This is why emotionally significant people often appear during periods of enormous transition. Not because the universe waited until you suffered enough, but because psychological openness increases when certainty disappears. When your old identity cracks, new possibilities can finally enter. Imagine carrying a glass completely filled with water. No matter how much fresh water someone tries to pour in, nothing new can fit. The glass must first be emptied. Emotionally, many of us spend years carrying glasses already overflowing with expectations, old beliefs, childhood fears, unresolved grief, false identities, unspoken resentment, perfectionism, people-pleasing, control. There simply isn't space for something fundamentally new. Then life begins removing what no longer serves you. Not all at once. Usually piece by piece. One friendship ends. One illusion disappears. One belief collapses. One identity no longer fits. Each loss feels personal. Each ending feels devastating. Yet months later, you often look back and realize something unexpected. Had those things remained, the life you're living now would never have become possible. Have you ever noticed how often people say, "I never would have chosen that experience, but I wouldn't become who I am today without it"? This isn't romanticizing suffering. It's recognizing one of psychology's deepest observations. Human beings often discover strengths they never knew they possessed only after the old strategies stopped working. Perhaps you've experienced this already. Years ago, you believed your worth depended on being needed. Today, you're learning that your worth exists even when you're alone. Years ago, you believed love required sacrificing yourself. Today, you're beginning to understand that healthy love requires honesty more than self-abandonment. Years ago, you feared endings. Today, you recognize that some endings are actually invitations. Not invitations toward another person, but invitations toward yourself. This changes the way we interpret life-changing connections. Instead of asking, "Why did they come after everything fell apart?" Perhaps we begin asking, who was I becoming because everything fell apart? That question shifts the entire perspective. Because maybe the connection wasn't sent to rescue the person you used to be. Maybe it arrived to meet the person you were becoming. There is another psychological phenomenon worth considering. After major emotional disruption, the brain becomes unusually attentive. Researchers sometimes describe this as increased salience. Experiences that previously seemed ordinary suddenly become deeply meaningful. Conversations feel richer. Nature appears more beautiful. Music touches emotions it never reached before. You become more aware of subtle details. More reflective. More introspective. More open. This heightened awareness doesn't guarantee that every encounter carries cosmic significance. But it does explain why certain people enter your life at exactly the moment you're finally capable of seeing them differently. Sometimes the greatest change isn't the arrival of another person. It's the transformation of the observer. You. Because had you met them 5 years earlier, perhaps you wouldn't have noticed them. Or perhaps they would have noticed you. But neither of you would have been emotionally available. Timing isn't always about fate. Sometimes timing is about readiness. Readiness to hear truths that once felt threatening. Readiness to release identities that once felt necessary. Readiness to stop chasing versions of love that required you to disappear. Many people interpret this stage through the language of twin flames. They believe every collapse cleared the path for a soul-level reunion. Whether you embrace that belief literally or see it as a powerful metaphor, the psychological insight remains compelling. The relationships that transform us most often arrive when our old ways of living can no longer continue. Not because life is punishing us, but because growth often begins where certainty ends. Perhaps the greatest illusion was never believing everything was falling apart. Perhaps the illusion was believing the old version of yourself could carry you into the future you secretly longed for. Every ending removed something. Every disappointment exposed something. Every betrayal revealed something. Not simply about other people, but about the boundaries you needed to build, the voice you needed to reclaim, the self-respect you needed to rediscover, and the life you were finally ready to create. So maybe the collapse wasn't the opposite of your journey. Maybe it was the doorway. Not the doorway into another person's arms, but the doorway into becoming someone capable of receiving love without abandoning yourself. And perhaps that is the deepest form of soul recognition of all. Because before another soul can truly recognize you, you must first become willing to recognize the person you've been becoming through every challenge, every loss, and every beginning disguised as an ending. In the next chapter, we'll explore why these extraordinary connections often feel as though they awaken memories that don't seem to belong to this lifetime, and how psychology explains the powerful sensation of "I've known you forever" without diminishing the emotional depth of the experience. Have you ever met someone for the very first time, and yet nothing about the encounter felt new? You knew their name had never crossed your lips before. You knew your lives had never intersected. You knew, logically, that they were a stranger. Yet somewhere beyond logic, your entire being whispered a different story. I know this feeling. Not necessarily their face. Not necessarily their voice. But the feeling. The strange comfort. The unexplainable familiarity. The sense that something inside you relaxed before your mind had time to ask whether it was safe. It is one of the most mysterious human experiences. People from every culture have described it for centuries. Some call it déjà vu. Others describe it as soul recognition. Some believe it is evidence of past lives. Others understand it through psychology, attachment, or neuroscience. Different languages, different explanations, yet they all attempt to describe the same deeply human experience. The feeling that someone new somehow feels profoundly familiar. But why? Why does this happen? And perhaps even more importantly, why does it happen with only a handful of people throughout an entire lifetime? The easy answer would be to simply say, it is destiny. But the human mind deserves a deeper exploration. Because whether you interpret this experience spiritually or psychologically, the mechanisms behind it reveal something extraordinary about how we create meaning, form relationships, and understand ourselves. Let's begin with something surprisingly simple. Your brain is not designed merely to remember events. It is designed to recognize patterns. Every day, without your awareness, your mind compares present experiences with thousands of memories stored across your lifetime. Not only conscious memories, but emotional memories, sensory memories, relational memories, the smell of rain that reminds you of childhood, a song that instantly brings back someone's face, a certain laugh that echoes someone you once loved, a familiar expression, a familiar silence, a familiar way of looking at the world. Most of these associations happen beneath conscious awareness. You don't decide to make them. Your nervous system does it automatically. Imagine walking through a forest. You notice a particular tree. Something about it feels familiar. You can't explain why. Later you realize it resembles the tree outside your grandparents' home, where you spent countless summers as a child. The recognition wasn't magical. It was associative. Your brain connected today's experience with an emotional memory stored years earlier. Now imagine applying this process to human relationships. Perhaps someone's kindness resembles the warmth of a teacher who believed in you. Perhaps their curiosity reminds you of a childhood friend who made you feel accepted. Perhaps their quiet confidence mirrors qualities you have secretly admired all your life. Your conscious mind may not identify these similarities immediately, but your subconscious notices them almost instantly. It quietly says, "This feels important." That simple sentence changes everything, because emotional familiarity often arrives before conscious understanding. Have you ever caught yourself trusting someone almost immediately, then wondering later why you felt so comfortable? Or perhaps the opposite, meeting someone who seemed perfectly pleasant, yet something inside you remained cautious. Long before your mind collected evidence, your nervous system had already begun forming impressions. This doesn't mean your first impressions are always correct. They aren't. Sometimes trauma creates false alarms. Sometimes hope creates unrealistic expectations. Sometimes loneliness convinces us that familiarity equals compatibility. This is why psychological awareness matters. Because not every intense feeling points toward lifelong connection. Some feelings point toward unresolved wounds. Others point toward genuine safety. Learning the difference is one of the most important emotional skills a person can develop. Consider this carefully. Have you ever mistaken emotional intensity for emotional intimacy? Many people do. An unpredictable relationship can feel incredibly exciting. The uncertainty creates emotional highs and lows. The brain releases powerful neurochemicals during cycles of anticipation and relief. Eventually, excitement becomes confused with love. Chaos becomes confused with passion. Inconsistency becomes confused with destiny. But authentic recognition often feels different. It may still be emotionally powerful. Yet beneath the intensity, there is also a surprising sense of calm. Instead of constantly asking, "How do I make them stay?" you begin wondering, "Why do I feel so much like myself around this person?" Notice the difference. One question emerges from fear. The other emerges from presence. Many psychologists describe healthy relationships as environments where the nervous system experiences regulation rather than constant activation. You breathe more naturally. You think more clearly. You stop performing. You stop rehearsing conversations in your mind. You stop trying to become someone else. You simply exist. That experience can feel so unfamiliar that some people initially distrust it. After years of equating love with emotional struggle, peace almost feels suspicious. You wonder, shouldn't love be harder than this? But perhaps that belief was never love. Perhaps it was survival. Think back to your earliest relationships. Not romantic ones. The first people who taught you what connection looked like. Were emotions welcomed? Or dismissed? Was vulnerability encouraged? Or punished? Did you learn that love was dependable? Or unpredictable? Every answer shaped your internal expectations long before your first romance began. This is why two people can experience the exact same relationship in completely different ways. One feels secure. The other fears abandonment. One welcomes closeness. The other instinctively creates distance. Neither reaction appears out of nowhere. Both are rooted in stories the nervous system has been telling itself for years. Now imagine meeting someone whose presence gently challenges those stories. Someone patient enough to remain present when you expect them to leave. Someone consistent enough to make unpredictability feel unnecessary. Someone curious enough to understand rather than judge. At first, this doesn't simply feel comforting. It feels unfamiliar. Then gradually, something changes. The unfamiliar begins to feel strangely familiar. Not because you've lived this exact relationship before, but because your deeper self recognizes something you've always longed for. Psychologists sometimes distinguish between what is familiar because it is repeated, and what feels familiar because it aligns with our deeper emotional needs. These are not always the same thing. Someone raised in criticism may unconsciously seek critical partners because criticism feels familiar. Someone raised in unpredictability may mistake inconsistency for chemistry. Yet healing introduces another possibility. As emotional awareness grows, familiarity begins shifting. Instead of recognizing old wounds, you begin recognizing healthier patterns. Respect feels attractive. Honesty feels attractive. Emotional availability feels attractive. This transformation often surprises people. They say, "My type completely changed." Did it really? Or did your emotional landscape change? Because when your inner world changes, the people who resonate with you naturally begin changing too. This is why periods of healing frequently alter the kinds of connections you experience. Not because the world suddenly filled with different people, because you began perceiving different qualities. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That statement deserves reflection. How often do we label something as destiny, when we haven't yet explored the unconscious patterns shaping our choices? This question doesn't invalidate spiritual interpretations. Instead, it invites deeper self-awareness. Perhaps destiny and psychology are not always opponents. Perhaps they simply describe different dimensions of the same human journey. Whether you believe that souls recognize one another across lifetimes, or that the subconscious recognizes deeply meaningful emotional patterns, the invitation remains remarkably similar. Pay attention, not only to the other person, but to yourself. Ask different questions. Instead of, "Why can't I stop thinking about them?" Ask, "What part of myself came alive because of this connection?" Instead of, "What if they are my missing half?" Ask, "What qualities did this relationship awaken within me that had been dormant?" Instead of, "Why did they enter my life?" Ask, "What am I becoming because they entered my life?" Those questions shift the focus from dependency toward growth. And growth is where genuine transformation begins. Perhaps the greatest gift of profound connection is not certainty about another person's role in your life. Perhaps it is certainty that you are no longer the person you were before meeting them. Your perception has expanded. Your emotional awareness has deepened. Your understanding of yourself has become richer. Whether the relationship lasts a season, a decade, or an entire lifetime, that transformation remains. Because true recognition is never only about identifying another person. It is also about recognizing forgotten parts of yourself. The parts that still believe in love after disappointment. The parts that still hope after heartbreak. The parts that quietly waited beneath years of fear, waiting for the moment they could finally emerge into the light. So perhaps the feeling that you've known someone forever is not simply about the past. Perhaps it is also about the future. Perhaps, in their presence, you briefly caught a glimpse of the person you were always capable of becoming. And sometimes, that recognition changes a life far more deeply than any explanation ever could. In the next chapter, we'll explore one of the most misunderstood aspects of these extraordinary connections: why periods of silence, distance, or separation often become the catalyst for the deepest psychological transformation, and why what feels like losing the connection may actually reveal its most important lesson. There comes a moment in almost every deeply transformative connection when the silence becomes louder than the conversations ever were. The messages stop. The calls become less frequent. Plans disappear. Distance quietly enters where closeness once lived. And suddenly, the question that echoes through your mind is no longer, "Why did we meet?" It becomes, "Why did they leave?" Or perhaps they never truly left. Perhaps they are still alive, still somewhere in the world, continuing with their own life. Yet emotionally, they feel impossibly distant. For many people, this period becomes the most painful part of the entire experience. Not because love disappears, but because certainty does. The human mind can tolerate many things. It can adapt to disappointment. It can survive grief. It can eventually accept endings. But uncertainty is different. Uncertainty leaves every possibility open. Maybe they'll return. Maybe they won't. Maybe they still think about you. Maybe they've forgotten you completely. The brain doesn't know which story is true, so it keeps searching. Again, and again, and again. This endless search isn't a sign of weakness. It reflects something psychologists have observed for decades. The human nervous system struggles far more with incomplete stories than completed ones. Imagine reading a novel where the final chapter has been ripped out. You know the characters. You understand the conflict. But you'll never know how it ends. Your imagination immediately begins filling in the missing pages. One ending is hopeful. Another is tragic. Another is bittersweet. Without realizing it, your mind becomes the author. Relationships often work the same way. When closure never arrives, the imagination works overtime. You replay conversations. You analyze every message. You remember tiny details that once seemed insignificant. You wonder whether there was one sentence you should have said differently. One decision you should have made. One moment you somehow misunderstood. Hours become days. Days become months. Sometimes even years. Not because you're choosing to remain trapped. Because your mind is attempting to solve a puzzle that may not have a single answer. This is why silence can feel heavier than conflict. Conflict gives the mind something concrete. Silence leaves endless possibilities. And endless possibilities are emotionally exhausting. But what if separation serves another purpose besides creating questions? What if distance changes not only the relationship, but also the person experiencing it? Think back to every important chapter of your life. The moments that shaped your character most profoundly. Were they the periods when everything felt comfortable? Or were they the seasons when certainty disappeared? History, both personal and collective, suggests that transformation often accelerates during periods of loss. Not because pain automatically creates wisdom. Many people experience pain without growing from it. Growth happens when suffering becomes an invitation to awareness rather than permanent identity. There is an important difference. Some people spend years asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Others eventually begin asking, "What is this experience revealing about me?" Notice how different those questions feel. The first seeks someone to blame. The second seeks understanding. That shift changes everything. Perhaps this is why emotionally significant separations often feel so unsettling. They remove the distraction of another person. Without constant interaction, without messages, without explanations, you are left face to face with yourself. For many people, this is unfamiliar territory. During relationships, we naturally focus outward. What are they thinking? How do they feel? Why did they act that way? What do they want? But separation quietly reverses the direction of attention. Eventually, another question emerges. What do I want? At first, that question feels surprisingly difficult. Not because the answer doesn't exist. Because many people have spent years organizing their lives around everyone else's needs. Perhaps you've done this too. Maybe you've become exceptionally skilled at reading other people's emotions. You sensed tension before anyone spoke. You anticipated disappointment. You adapted. You compromised. You learned to keep peace. Those skills may have protected important relationships, but they also carried a hidden cost. Somewhere along the way, you stopped asking what brought you peace. Then the relationship changes. The silence arrives. And for the first time in years, there is space. Space can be frightening. When the noise disappears, emotions that have waited patiently beneath the surface begin speaking. Grief, fear, loneliness, hope, anger, relief. Sometimes all within the same hour. Many people believe they are grieving only the other person. But psychology reveals something more complex. Often, we grieve multiple losses simultaneously. We grieve the future we imagined, the version of ourselves we became with them, the routines we quietly loved, the conversations we expected would continue, the dreams that never had the chance to become reality. This is why separation feels so overwhelming. You're not mourning one thing. You're mourning an entire imagined future. And imagined futures can be surprisingly powerful. The brain does not sharply distinguish between vividly imagined experiences and emotionally meaningful memories. When you repeatedly pictured traveling together, growing older together, building a life together, those images became psychologically real. When reality changed, those internal worlds also collapsed. Naturally, grief followed. Yet something remarkable often begins during this process. Very slowly, almost invisibly, your identity begins reorganizing itself. At first, you don't notice. Then one day, you wake up and realize you made breakfast without thinking about them first. A week later, you hear a song that once made you cry. This time, you simply smile. Months later, you discover you've laughed more this week than you did the entire previous year. Healing rarely announces itself dramatically. It arrives quietly, one ordinary moment at a time. Many people mistakenly believe healing means forgetting. But forgetting is not the goal. Healthy psychological integration looks very different. You remember, but the memory no longer controls you. You think of them, but your entire day no longer collapses around the thought. The story remains part of your life. It simply stops being the center of your identity. This distinction matters, because some experiences are not meant to disappear. They become chapters, teachers, turning points, not prisons. Carl Jung believed that much of human development involves integrating previously unconscious parts of ourselves. Separation often accelerates this process. Without another person reflecting your identity back to you, you begin discovering who you are independently. This can feel incredibly uncomfortable. Imagine spending years looking into mirrors. Then suddenly, every mirror disappears. At first, you feel disoriented. Who are you now? How do you measure yourself? Eventually, something extraordinary happens. You stop searching for mirrors. You begin experiencing yourself directly. You no longer need constant reassurance that you're lovable, or worthy, or enough. Those truths begin growing from within instead of depending entirely upon external confirmation. This doesn't happen overnight. There will still be difficult mornings, unexpected memories, moments when a familiar place suddenly pulls your heart backward. Healing is rarely linear. Some days you'll feel free. Other days, one photograph or one familiar scent seems capable of reopening everything. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. The nervous system heals gradually, not mechanically. just as physical wounds itch before they fully recover. Emotional wounds often ache before they become wisdom. If you've experienced this, be patient with yourself. Progress isn't measured by how rarely you remember. It's measured by how gently you treat yourself when you do. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding surrounding profound connections is the belief that separation always represents failure. Sometimes it does. Some relationships genuinely end because they are no longer healthy. But other times, distance becomes the environment where emotional maturity develops. Think of a seed planted beneath the earth. From the surface, nothing appears to happen. Weeks pass. Rain falls. The ground remains unchanged. Yet beneath the soil, roots are forming. Growth is happening where no one can see it. Human transformation often follows the same pattern. Externally, your life may appear unchanged. Internally, your priorities are shifting. Your boundaries are strengthening. Your self-respect is growing. Your understanding of love is becoming clearer. The silence that once felt unbearable slowly becomes spacious instead of empty. You discover something unexpected. Your peace does not depend entirely upon another person's presence. That realization changes every future relationship. Because once you know you can survive loneliness, you stop accepting connections built upon fear. Once you know you can create your own sense of stability, you stop confusing emotional dependency with love. And once you recognize your own worth, you become less willing to abandon yourself simply to avoid losing someone else. Perhaps this has always been one of separation's deepest lessons. Not to convince you that love isn't real, but to show you that genuine love can never require the permanent abandonment of your authentic self. Whether this person eventually returns or remains a meaningful chapter in your past, the most lasting transformation has already begun. You are no longer the person who believed your happiness existed entirely outside yourself. You have started reclaiming something much deeper. Your voice, your boundaries, your emotional wisdom, your capacity to love without disappearing. Perhaps that is the quiet miracle hidden inside every meaningful separation. It invites you to stop waiting for someone else to complete your story, and begin writing the chapters that only you were ever capable of creating. Because sometimes the greatest reunion is not between two people. Sometimes it is the reunion between you and the version of yourself that had been waiting patiently beneath fear, longing, and uncertainty all along. There is a moment after separation that confuses almost everyone who goes through it. It is not the sadness that surprises you. It is not even the loneliness. It is the pull. That invisible force that keeps bringing them back into your thoughts when you are trying your hardest to move forward. You could be busy. You could be surrounded by people. You could be doing everything correctly to heal. And yet, suddenly, without warning, their memory appears again. A sentence they once said. A moment you thought you had forgotten. A feeling you didn't ask to relive. And in that instant, it is as if time bends slightly backward. Many people describe this experience as emotional attachment. Others call it obsession. Some interpret it spiritually as a soul bond that cannot be broken. But beneath all interpretations, psychological or mystical, there is a very real question. Why does your mind keep returning to someone who is no longer actively part of your life? To understand this, you have to look beyond the surface of love. Because what you are experiencing is not simply missing someone. It is a complex interaction between memory, emotion, and identity. Let's begin with something simple. Your brain does not store people as static images. It stores them as emotional networks. A person is not just a face in your memory. They are a collection of sensations. The way you felt when they looked at you. The tone of their voice when they were calm. The anxiety when they pulled away. The relief when they returned. Every interaction creates an emotional imprint. And the stronger the emotion, the stronger the imprint. This is why certain people do not fade easily. Not because they are objectively more important than others, but because they activated deeper emotional circuits in your nervous system. Now imagine what happens when a relationship contains both safety and uncertainty at the same time. Closeness followed by distance. Affection followed by silence. Hope followed by confusion. Your brain becomes trapped in a powerful learning loop. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It is the same mechanism that makes unpredictable rewards incredibly difficult to disengage from. Not because they are healthy, but because they are psychologically sticky. When something is consistently available, your brain adapts and stabilizes. But when something is inconsistent, your brain becomes hyper-focused. It keeps searching for patterns. It keeps trying to predict the next outcome. It keeps waiting for resolution. So when the connection ends or becomes unclear, the nervous system doesn't simply switch off. It continues scanning, searching, replaying, trying to complete what feels unfinished. This is why silence can feel louder than actual communication ever did. But there is another layer that makes this even more powerful. Memory is not just recall. Memory is reconstruction. Every time you remember someone, you are not accessing a perfect recording of the past. You are rebuilding the experience using emotional fragments. And here is the crucial part. You do not only remember what happened. You remember how it made you feel about yourself. This is why certain memories feel addictive. Because they are not just memories of another person. They are memories of a version of you that existed in their presence. The version of you that felt chosen, or seen, or emotionally alive in a way that felt rare. When the connection ends, your mind does not only lose the person. It loses access to that version of yourself. And so the mind begins doing something subtle but powerful. It replays the connection not only to remember them, but to temporarily re-enter that emotional state. This is why you don't just think about them randomly. You think about specific moments. Moments where something felt significant. A glance that lingered too long. A conversation that felt deeper than usual. A silence that felt charged with meaning. Your mind keeps returning to those moments because they represent emotional intensity. And emotional intensity becomes psychologically memorable. But there is still something deeper happening. Human beings are meaning-making systems. We do not experience life passively. We interpret it. We assign significance. We build narratives. So when someone enters your life and disrupts your emotional equilibrium, your mind immediately begins constructing a story around it. What was that? Why did it feel like that? What does it mean that I felt so strongly? And when no clear resolution is available, the mind does not stop the story. It continues it internally. This is how emotional attachment becomes cognitive looping. The relationship ends externally, but continues internally. Not because you want it to, but because your brain has not received closure. And closure is not always about answers from another person. Sometimes closure is simply the brain accepting uncertainty as final. But for many people, uncertainty feels unacceptable. So the mind keeps the connection alive, internally, as a way of avoiding unresolved tension. There is also something profoundly important happening at the level of identity. Certain relationships do not just affect your emotions. They reorganize your self-concept. You begin to see yourself differently in their presence. More open, more vulnerable, more expressive, or perhaps more anxious, more dependent, more unsure. Then the relationship ends. But your nervous system does not immediately update its internal model of who I am. So part of you remains psychologically attached not just to them, but to who you became around them. This is why letting go can feel like losing a version of yourself, not just losing a person. And this is also why healing often feels like identity reconstruction rather than simple emotional recovery. But there is another layer that many people overlook entirely. The mind often confuses emotional activation with significance. Just because someone made you feel intensely does not automatically mean they are meant to define your future. But intensity creates weight in memory. And weight creates importance. So the brain labels them as meaningful simply because the emotional signal was strong. However, strong emotion is not always clarity. Sometimes it is activation without alignment. Sometimes it is nervous system dysregulation mistaken for destiny. This is where many people become stuck. They assume that because the feeling is strong, it must mean something external and permanent. But psychologically, intensity is often more about internal activation than external truth. Now consider what happens when two people trigger each other's deepest emotional patterns. One person activates attachment fears. The other activates abandonment wounds. The connection becomes emotionally charged not because it is stable, but because it is unresolved on both sides. And unresolved systems rarely disengage easily. Even after separation, the emotional system continues to seek equilibrium. That is why thoughts return. That is why dreams appear. That is why random memories surface at unexpected times. Not because the connection is actively calling you back, but because your mind is still trying to stabilize what was destabilized. Over time, something begins to shift, but not because the thoughts disappear immediately. They lose their emotional charge. At first, thinking of them feels like being pulled backward. Later, it feels like remembering. Eventually, it becomes neutral information stored in your personal history. This transformation is gradual, and it cannot be forced. It happens through repetition of lived experience without them. New memories slowly overwrite the emotional dominance of the old ones. New identities begin forming. New connections appear. New experiences expand your internal world. And one day, without realizing it, you notice that the pull is no longer pulling. It has softened. Not because the connection was meaningless, but because your nervous system no longer treats it as unfinished survival business. And this is the part many people misunderstand. Letting go is not the absence of love. It is the absence of psychological urgency. You can still care. You can still remember. You can still acknowledge that the connection changed you. But it no longer controls your emotional baseline. It no longer dictates your inner weather. And when that shift finally happens, something important becomes clear. The goal was never to erase the connection. The goal was to integrate it, to understand it, to grow through it, and to release the illusion that emotional intensity alone determines destiny. Because sometimes the strongest pull in your life is not pointing you toward someone else. It is pointing you back toward yourself. And once you truly begin to return to yourself, the pull doesn't need to disappear. It simply no longer needs to hold you. There is a quiet turning point in every intense emotional journey that almost no one notices while it is happening. It does not arrive with drama. It does not announce itself with clarity. It does not feel like victory. In fact, at first, it feels like disappointment. It feels like something is fading. Something is losing its meaning. Something you once held tightly in your heart suddenly begins to feel different. Not gone, not erased, but no longer consuming you in the same way. And for a moment, that shift can feel unsettling, because the mind becomes attached not only to people, but to the intensity of meaning it created around them. For a long time, this connection may have felt like the center of your emotional world. Every thought seemed to circle back to it. Every silence felt like it was speaking about it. Every coincidence felt like a sign. Every memory felt charged with significance. It was not just a relationship in your mind. It became a narrative, a symbolic structure, a story that gave emotional shape to your inner world. But then something begins to change. Slowly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, the emotional charge starts to weaken. The urgency softens. The thoughts still appear, but they no longer pull you into the same depth of feeling. And this is where the illusion begins to break. Not the illusion of love, but the illusion of permanence in emotional intensity. Because what once felt like an unshakable force turns out to be something far more fluid. This moment often confuses people deeply. They assume that if the feeling changes, then something must have been lost. But psychologically, what is actually happening is integration. Your nervous system is recalibrating. It is no longer interpreting the experience as an open emotional loop that requires constant attention. Instead, it begins to categorize it as something that belongs to your past rather than your present survival state. This shift is subtle but profound, and it reveals something important about human perception. We do not experience reality directly. We experience our interpretation of reality through emotional filters. When something is unresolved, the filter becomes intense. Everything connected to that experience feels amplified. But when resolution begins to form internally, the emotional amplification decreases. And suddenly, what once felt overwhelming becomes understandable. Not because the event changed, but because you changed. This is the part many people misinterpret as falling out of love. But it is not falling out of love. It is falling out of emotional entanglement. There is a difference. Love, in its healthiest form, does not require obsession. It does not require confusion. It does not require emotional instability. But early emotional imprinting often does. When a connection activates deep attachment systems, the mind tends to amplify its importance. It assigns meaning far beyond what can be objectively measured. This is how someone can become everything in your inner narrative for a period of time. Not because they objectively are everything, but because they activated everything within you. Your longing, your fear, your hope, your vulnerability, your desire to be understood. All of it becomes projected onto one focal point. And that focal point begins to feel larger than life. But as time passes and emotional distance increases, something important happens. You begin to see the connection not only from inside the experience, but from outside it. This shift in perspective is crucial. Inside the experience, everything feels absolute. Every moment feels meaningful. Every interaction feels like it carries hidden significance. But from outside the experience, you begin to notice patterns, repetitions, emotional cycles, attachment responses. Your perspective expands, and with that expansion comes clarity. This is why distance is often necessary for understanding. Not because distance weakens love, but because proximity can distort perception. When you are inside an emotional storm, you cannot fully analyze its structure. You can only feel its force. But once the storm passes, you begin to understand its movement. You see what triggered it. You see how it developed. You see how your nervous system responded. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to see your own patterns more clearly than the person you were focused on. This is the real turning point. Not when you stop thinking about them, but when thinking about them no longer defines how you think about yourself. At first, the illusion feels like meaning. Then it begins to feel like memory. And eventually, it becomes simply part of your life story. Not the center of it. One of the most profound realizations during this stage is that emotional intensity is not the same as emotional truth. Just because something felt overwhelming does not mean it was destined. Just because something felt magnetic does not mean it was sustainable. Just because something felt fated does not mean it was aligned with your long-term emotional well-being. The mind often confuses activation with alignment because both feel powerful. But they are not the same. Activation pulls you into emotional extremes. Alignment brings you into stability. And over time, stability reveals itself as something far more nourishing than intensity ever could be. This is where the psychological illusion begins to dissolve. Not through rejection, not through suppression, but through understanding. You start to see that the connection did not define you. It revealed you. It showed you how deeply you can feel, how quickly you can attach meaning, how strongly your nervous system responds to emotional inconsistency, how much you long for clarity, safety, and recognition. And once you see this clearly, you cannot unsee it. The story changes shape. What once felt like fate begins to feel like insight. What once felt like destiny begins to feel like emotional education. What once felt like loss begins to feel like awakening. And this shift is not cold. It is liberating. because it returns your attention to where it has always belonged. Not outside of you, but within you. There is a quiet freedom in realizing that no single connection has the power to define your entire emotional reality unless you unconsciously allow it to. This does not diminish the importance of what you felt. It honors it more deeply by placing it in context. Because when you understand your emotional patterns, you are no longer controlled by them. You can feel without being consumed. You can remember without being pulled backward. You can care without losing yourself. And this is where healing begins to stabilize into something more permanent. Not because the past disappears, but because it loses its authority over your present identity. Eventually, you reach a point where the connection no longer feels like a question. It becomes an answer. Not about them, but about you. About your capacity for attachment. About your emotional depth. About your need for meaning. About your journey towards self-awareness. And in that realization, something softens inside you. The urgency fades. The searching stops. Not because everything is resolved externally, but because it has been understood internally. This is the moment the illusion breaks. Not the illusion of connection, but the illusion that you were ever lost within it. Because what you were experiencing was never meant to define you. It was meant to awaken you. And once awakening happens, you do not return to who you were before. You become someone who can finally see clearly. And in that clarity, even the most intense emotional experiences find their rightful place. Not as fate, not as confusion, but as chapters in a much larger unfolding story. One that has always been guiding you back toward yourself. There is a point in every intense emotional journey where something quietly shifts, not in the external situation, but inside you. It does not feel dramatic. There is no final confrontation. No sudden clarity spoken by another person. No perfectly timed message that explains everything. Instead, there is something much quieter. You wake up one day and realize that the emotional storm you once lived inside is no longer shaping your entire inner world. The thoughts are still there. The memories still exist. But they no longer carry the same weight. They no longer dictate your emotional state. And for a brief moment, you might not even notice the difference. Because healing does not announce itself. It integrates itself into your life slowly, until one day you realize it has already happened. This is the return to self. A stage that many people reach, but few fully understand while they are in it. For a long time, your attention may have been anchored outside of you. To someone else. To what they meant. To what they did. To what they didn't do. To what you hoped they would become in your life. Your emotional energy may have been invested in interpretation. Analyzing meaning. Decoding silence. Searching for signs. Trying to understand whether something invisible was still alive between you. And during that phase, your inner world becomes highly reactive. Every memory feels significant. Every thought feels urgent. Every emotional shift feels like it demands explanation. But eventually, something begins to change in a very subtle way. The emotional urgency begins to fade. Not because you have forgotten, but because your nervous system has stopped treating the experience as an open wound. It begins to categorize it differently. Not as something currently happening, but as something that happened. This distinction might sound small, but psychologically it is profound. Because the human mind does not experience time in a purely linear way. It experiences emotional time. Events that are emotionally active feel present, even if they happened years ago. And events that have been integrated feel distant, even if they happened recently. So when your emotional system begins to settle, something important occurs. The past returns to its place in the timeline. It stops invading the present. And this is where selfhood begins to re-emerge. For a long time, your identity may have been intertwined with the connection. You were not only yourself. You were also someone who loved them. Someone who missed them. Someone who waited. Someone who hoped. Someone who struggled to let go. These emotional roles can become deeply embedded in identity. to the point where you unconsciously define yourself through them. But when the intensity fades, those roles begin to dissolve. And for a moment, there is a strange emptiness. Not painful in the same way as before, but unfamiliar. Because you are no longer the version of yourself that existed in emotional dependency. And you have not yet fully become the version of yourself that exists beyond it. This in-between state is where transformation happens. It is not a loss of identity. It is a restructuring of identity. You begin to notice things that were previously hidden beneath emotional intensity. Your interests start returning. Your attention expands outward again. You become curious about life in ways that had been temporarily overshadowed. You notice small details again. Music feels different. Time feels different. Even silence feels different. Because you are no longer constantly occupied with internal emotional processing. One of the most important psychological changes at this stage is the return of agency. During intense attachment, a large portion of your mental energy is spent on what the other person is doing, feeling, or thinking. Your internal world is reactive. But in the return to self, the direction of attention shifts. It turns inward again. What do I feel right now? What do I need? What actually matters to me beyond this experience? These questions may seem simple, but for someone who has been emotionally absorbed in another person for a long time, they can feel surprisingly unfamiliar. Yet they are the foundation of emotional independence. Because healing is not just about releasing someone else. It is about re-establishing connection with yourself. There is also a deeper realization that often emerges during this stage. You begin to see that emotional intensity is not proof of destiny. It is proof of activation. The connection did not simply show you another person. It activated emotional systems within you that were already waiting to be seen. Attachment patterns, longing, fear of loss, desire for validation, capacity for deep love, sensitivity to emotional inconsistency. These were not created by the relationship. They were revealed by it. And once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen. This is why the experience remains meaningful even after detachment begins. Because you are not only letting go of a person, you are integrating an experience that changed your understanding of yourself. As this integration continues, something else becomes possible. Perspective. You begin to see the entire journey differently. What once felt like confusion begins to look like a pattern. What once felt like fate begins to look like emotional learning. What once felt like loss begins to look like transformation. Not because you are trying to rationalize pain, but because distance from emotional intensity allows clarity to emerge. This is one of the most powerful aspects of psychological healing. Clarity does not erase emotion. It reorganizes it. It places experience into context, and context reduces suffering. Not by changing the past, but by changing your relationship to it. At some point, you may notice something even more subtle. The absence of constant thinking about them no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like space. And in that space, something new begins to grow. Not necessarily a new relationship, but a renewed sense of self. You begin to realize that your emotional world does not need to orbit around one experience to feel meaningful. Life expands again. Possibilities return. You are no longer defined by what you lost. You are defined by what you are becoming. And perhaps the most important realization of all begins to take shape quietly in the background of your awareness. The connection, no matter how intense, was never the center of your life's meaning. It was a chapter, a significant one, a transformative one, but still a chapter. Not the entire story. And when you begin to see it this way, something deep inside softens. Not into indifference, but into understanding. You can acknowledge its importance without being consumed by it. You can respect what it awakened in you without needing it to continue. You can remember without reopening the wound. This is emotional maturity. Not the absence of feeling, but the ability to hold feeling without being controlled by it. And as this maturity deepens, something quietly profound happens. You stop searching for closure outside of yourself, because you realize that closure was never something another person could fully give you. It was something you had to build internally through understanding, acceptance, and integration. And once that realization settles in, the emotional narrative that once felt unfinished begins to close itself naturally. Not with answers, but with clarity. Not with reunion, but with peace. And in that peace, you begin to see something you may have missed throughout the entire journey. You were never truly lost. You were simply becoming. And everything you thought you were searching for in another person was slowly guiding you back to the one place you had always been meant to return to: yourself. There is a stage in emotional healing that almost no one recognizes while it is happening. It is not the moment of clarity. It is not the moment of release. It is not even the moment you move on. It is something quieter than all of those. So quiet, in fact, that many people mistake it for nothing at all. But inside you, something profound is taking place. The emotional charge that once defined your inner world has not vanished. It has been absorbed, integrated, reorganized into a different structure of meaning. You still remember everything. The moments, the conversations, the silence that felt heavier than words, the hope you once held, the confusion that followed, the intensity that once made your chest tighten at the thought of them. But now, when those memories arise, they no longer pull you into emotional turbulence. They simply appear, and then pass through you, without resistance, without collapse, without urgency. This is what psychological integration actually looks like. Not forgetting, not detachment in the cold sense, but emotional neutrality emerging from deep understanding. And for many people, this stage is more confusing than heartbreak itself. Because suffering is familiar. Intensity is familiar. Longing is familiar. Even obsession has a recognizable rhythm. But this quiet state, this absence of emotional volatility, feels unfamiliar. And the mind, always trying to interpret experience through old frameworks, often asks, why don't I feel anything anymore? Does this mean it never mattered? Have I become cold? But the truth is far more subtle. You are not becoming less emotional. You are becoming less reactive. There is a difference, a profound one. Emotional reactivity is when your internal world is constantly shaped by triggers, memories, thoughts, reminders, imagined scenarios. Emotional integration is when those same triggers no longer reorganize your entire state of being. They exist, but they no longer command you. Think of it like a storm that once controlled the entire sky of your mind. At one point, every cloud was part of that storm. Every thought carried its electricity. Every memory carried its rain. But now the weather has changed. The sky is still there. The clouds still appear. But the storm has passed through. And what remains is space. This space is not emptiness. It is stability. Yet stability can feel strangely unfamiliar to someone who has lived inside emotional turbulence for a long time. Because the nervous system, especially one that has adapted to intensity, can begin to equate calm with absence. But calm is not absence. It is regulation. And regulation is one of the highest forms of emotional maturity the human system can reach. During this stage, something interesting often happens. You begin to notice that memories of the connection no longer arrive with emotional weight. Instead, they arrive with perspective. You can think about them as if you are observing a chapter in a book you once read. You remember the plot. You remember the characters. You remember how it made you feel at the time. But you are no longer inside the story. You are observing it from outside. This shift in perspective is not accidental. It is the result of repeated emotional processing without reinforcement of attachment. Over time, the brain stops reinforcing the emotional pathways associated with longing and uncertainty. Neural pathways that were once highly active begin to weaken. Not because they are erased, but because they are no longer constantly activated. And as they weaken, new pathways emerge. Pathways associated with self-awareness, stability, present moment awareness, and internal grounding. This is why life begins to feel different again. Not dramatically, but subtly. You notice small changes first. You wake up without an immediate emotional pull toward the past. You engage with daily life more fully. You respond rather than react. You pause instead of spiral. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your identity begins to expand beyond the role of someone who is healing from a connection. Because even healing can become an identity if one remains there too long. At some point, healing must become life again. And life does not revolve around absence. It revolves around presence. One of the most profound realizations during this stage is that the connection did not define your emotional capacity. It revealed it. It showed you how deeply you can feel, how intensely you can attach meaning, how strongly your inner world responds to emotional significance. But it also showed you something else. That intensity alone is not sustainable as a foundation for long-term peace. Because the human nervous system is not designed to remain in constant activation. It needs rhythm. It needs balance. It needs recovery. And when that recovery finally happens, something within you begins to reset. You stop interpreting emotional calm as loss. You stop interpreting absence as emptiness. You stop interpreting silence as unanswered questions. Instead, silence becomes what it always was meant to be. Space for life to unfold. There is also another shift that happens during this phase, one that is even more subtle. You begin to remember yourself without reference to the connection. At earlier stages, even your identity was often defined in relation to them. I am the one who misses them. I am the one who cannot forget. I am the one who still feels connected. But in this stage, those definitions begin to dissolve. And something new emerges. I am the one who is here. Just here. In your own life. In your own experience. Without constant reference to the past. This may sound simple, but psychologically it represents a significant restructuring of identity. Because attachment does not only bind emotion. It binds self-perception. And when that binding loosens, identity expands. You begin to rediscover interests that had been overshadowed. You reconnect with people in your life with more presence. You engage with the world, not as someone searching for meaning in the past, but as someone participating in the present. And perhaps the most surprising part of this stage is that nothing dramatic is required for this shift to occur. No final conversation. No closure from the other person. No sudden realization. It happens through time. Through repetition. Through the natural decay of emotional intensity when it is no longer continuously reinforced. This is why many people only realize they have reached this stage in hindsight. They look back and notice. I don't think about them the same way anymore. Not because they decided to stop, but because their emotional system has already completed the transition. And once this realization settles, another truth becomes visible. What once felt like emotional survival now feels like emotional history. Not erased, not dismissed, but placed where it belongs. In the past. There is a quiet power in this. Because it means your emotional world is no longer defined by what once overwhelmed you. It is defined by what you have integrated. And integration is not about eliminating memory. It is about changing your relationship to memory. You no longer need to avoid it. You no longer need to chase it. You no longer need to interpret it. You simply understand it. And understanding removes urgency. Without urgency, there is no emotional dependency. Without dependency, there is no internal collapse. And without collapse, there is space for something far more stable to emerge. Self-trust. The belief that your emotional world is no longer something you must escape from or be controlled by, but something you can move through with awareness. At this stage, you may still feel occasional echoes of the past. A familiar song. A place you once visited. A passing thought that appears unexpectedly. But none of these moments destabilize you anymore. They simply pass through your awareness like clouds across a vast sky, and you remain unchanged beneath them. This is not indifference. It is resilience. And resilience is not built by avoiding emotional depth. It is built by surviving emotional depth without losing yourself in it. So when you reach this stage, something important becomes clear. The journey was never about forgetting someone. It was about remembering yourself without distortion, without projection, without emotional entanglement, without needing another person to define your internal state. And in that remembering, something quietly profound becomes possible. You no longer ask whether the connection was fate or coincidence, because the answer no longer matters in the same way. What matters is what it awakened in you, what it revealed, what it transformed, and who you became because of it. And perhaps that is the final integration. Not the end of the story, but the end of needing the story to still be unresolved. Because when peace finally arrives, it does not ask for explanation. It simply stays. And in that staying, you realize you have returned to the one place you were always meant to be. Yourself. There is a final stage in every profound emotional journey that very few people ever consciously recognize while they are living it. It does not arrive with intensity. It does not arrive with longing. It does not arrive with spiritual signs, emotional storms, or overwhelming synchronicities. Instead, it arrives in the simplest way possible. Nothing pulls you anymore. Nothing haunts you the same way. Nothing feels unfinished inside your mind. And for the first time in a long time, you are no longer searching. Not for them. Not for answers. Not for meaning hidden in silence. Not even for closure. Because something fundamental has changed in the structure of your inner world. You are no longer inside the experience. You are beyond it. This is not detachment in the way people usually imagine it. It is not emotional suppression. It is not avoidance. It is not indifference born from pain. It is something far more complete. It is integration so deep that the experience no longer requires emotional maintenance. You do not have to let go anymore, because there is nothing holding you in place. And this is where the real transformation reveals itself. For a long time, the journey may have felt like it was about another person. Their presence, their absence, their timing, their silence, their meaning in your life. But at this stage, something becomes undeniably clear. They were never the center of the transformation. They were the catalyst, the activation point, the mirror that revealed what was already within you. Because what truly changed was not the relationship itself, but your capacity to understand yourself through it. Every intense connection carries a hidden psychological function. It exposes unconscious emotional patterns that normally remain invisible. Attachment needs, fear of abandonment, desire for validation, longing for emotional safety, the tendency to idealize, the tendency to withdraw, the tendency to overinterpret meaning. None of these patterns are created by the other person. They are revealed through interaction. And once something is revealed clearly enough, it cannot be unseen. This is why true emotional transformation is irreversible. You do not return to ignorance once awareness has expanded. You may return to old environments, old habits, old emotional impulses, but your perception is different now. And perception changes everything. At this final stage, something very subtle happens in your emotional system. The need for resolution disappears. Not because everything has been answered, but because uncertainty no longer feels threatening. This is one of the deepest markers of psychological maturity. The ability to exist without needing emotional completion from external sources. At earlier stages, the mind demands closure. It demands explanation. It demands meaning that reduces discomfort. But now, the mind no longer insists. It observes. It accepts. It allows. And in that allowance, something unexpected emerges. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on circumstances, but the stable kind that exists regardless of them. This is where the illusion of unfinished emotional loops finally dissolves. Because you realize something important. Nothing was ever truly incomplete. It only felt incomplete because your nervous system was still processing intensity. But once processing is complete, the illusion of incompleteness disappears. And what remains is simply memory. Neutral, stable, integrated. At this stage, even the concept of letting go feels outdated. Because letting go implies effort. It implies struggle. It implies resistance against something still gripping you. But here, there is nothing gripping you anymore. There is only understanding. And understanding does not require force. It requires awareness. You begin to notice that your thoughts no longer orbit around the past. When the memory appears, it does not expand into a story. It does not trigger emotional spirals. It does not reopen internal questions. It simply passes through consciousness like a passing reflection. You see it, and then you return to life. Not as an escape, but as a natural continuation of presence. This is what emotional liberation actually looks like. Not forgetting, not erasing, but no longer being internally governed by what once consumed you. And perhaps the most surprising realization at this stage is this. You do not feel healed in the dramatic sense people often imagine. You feel normal again, but a deeper version of normal. A version of normal that includes self-awareness, emotional stability, and internal clarity that did not exist before the experience. This is why the journey cannot be reduced to simply moving on. Because what has happened is not movement away from something. It is movement into yourself. At this level of integration, you begin to see the entire experience differently. What once felt like destiny now feels like development. What once felt like obsession now feels like emotional activation. What once felt like loss now feels like expansion. Not because you are rewriting history, but because you are finally seeing it without emotional distortion. And in that clarity, something very quiet but very powerful emerges. Gratitude. Not for the pain itself, but for what the experience revealed about you. Your depth, your sensitivity, your capacity for connection, your resilience in emotional uncertainty, your ability to survive emotional intensity without losing your essential self. These qualities were always present, but the experience brought them into awareness. And once you see yourself clearly, you cannot return to the version of you who did not. This is why the final stage of emotional transformation is not closure. It is recognition, not of the other person, but of yourself. You recognize the patterns that once shaped your attachment. You recognize the emotional needs that guided your choices. You recognize the illusions that once felt like truth. And in recognizing them, they lose their power over you. There is also a shift in how you perceive connection itself. You no longer associate love with intensity alone. You begin to understand that real connection is not defined by emotional extremes. It is defined by stability, respect, presence, and mutual awareness. Intensity may still exist, but it is no longer the measure of meaning. This changes everything about how you relate to future relationships. You become more grounded, more observant, less likely to confuse emotional activation with compatibility, less likely to abandon yourself in the name of feeling something powerful, because you now understand something deeply. What feels overwhelming is not always what is aligned, and what is calm is not always what is empty. Sometimes calm is simply what healthy connection feels like when the nervous system is no longer in survival mode. At this stage, even memory itself transforms. It no longer carries emotional urgency. It becomes narrative, a story within your life. Not the center of it. You can reflect without reliving. You can acknowledge without reopening. You can remember without returning. And this ability is one of the clearest signs of psychological integration. Because the past no longer interrupts the present. It coexists with it peacefully. And then something very simple happens. You stop asking questions that once consumed you. You stop wondering what it meant in a desperate way. You stop searching for hidden answers in silence. Not because you have solved everything, but because you no longer need to. The need itself has dissolved. And in that dissolution, freedom appears. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. It is the freedom of being internally complete even when life is still unfolding. It is the freedom of no longer outsourcing emotional stability. It is the freedom of no longer needing a specific person, outcome, or explanation to feel whole. And this is the deepest truth the entire journey has been pointing toward from the beginning. The connection was never the destination. It was the doorway. And once you walk through it fully, you do not remain searching outside. You begin living inside your own life again. Fully, quietly, completely. And in that return, something becomes clear without needing words. You were never broken. You were becoming. And now you have arrived.